Hello! It has been so long since I've recorded a video. It has been almost 2 months. Well, not 2 months, but at least a month and a half. Since I've recorded a video, and at least a month since I actually read this section that I'm about to talk about. I haven't read past this section in the book, but I read this and I was going to record a video, and then I got COVID. And I still have a bit of a cough even a month later. I guess my lungs just are still recovering. But I'm finally well enough to talk for a while, so I'm finally recording this video. Thankfully, my memory of this particular section of the book is very, very strong, because this section is incredibly evocative, and I have so many thoughts about it. So, without further ado, let us get into the first part of the second Soldier Son book, Forest Mage. So, there's several different threads I want to work through here. Let's start with the one that's sort of going through the whole thing, which is Nevare's character development. I've talked about before in my original videos about the first book. I've talked about the interesting thing with Nevare's character in the first book, which is that he is very boring. He is a boring character in the first book. And I posited the theory that that's not because Robin Hobb failed to make him interesting, but rather because he's boring on purpose, because she made a very risky decision that paid off to sort of manifest the lack within Nevare as a result of the part of him that was taken from him by the Tree Woman. As essentially on a meta level, his character being less interesting, because sort of the more vibrant, exciting parts of him are missing. And this was never made explicit in the first book, but it was definitely an element that was there. And I wasn't 100% sure of that theory. I was like 80% sure by the end of the first book, because I was under the impression that Nevare sort of stopped being interesting once he lost the other half of himself, and that maybe now he would become interesting again, that he'd regained it, but I wasn't 100% sure. Now I'm 100% sure that I was right, and that that was on purpose, because this entire section of the book is constantly Nevare sort of essentially feeling more alive than he's ever felt. There is a there is an abundance of both positive and negative emotions, of an intensity he just didn't feel in the first book, constantly welling up within him. He takes more risks, he does reckless things, he follows his impulses, his instincts, his sort of physical desires more. He is less sort of stuck in his own head and constantly just thinking more than acting. He is much more active, much more sort of thrusting himself forward into the plot. And again, it's actually confirmed in this section that this is an effect of him recovering his other half. He actually concludes as much himself. He notices this change in himself, and he comments that it is because of the recovery of his other half. This is an incredibly well executed bit of writing on Hobb's part. The actual idea of someone losing, like, the vibrancy from their life due to a magical thing and then regaining it, is not that unusual. It's definitely been done, but I don't think it's ever been done this well, or with this much subtlety and respect for the reader's intelligence, because it is very much all done through implication. like you have to pick up on it in order to notice it, and I always like that. I am a huge fan of books that sort of expect you to be a bit smart about them while reading them. Um, funnily enough, this is also something I greatly enjoy about the other thing I'm reading right now, which is the Locked Tomb trilogy. Yeah, this is a great sort of character beat for Navarre. However, that's not all that's going on with Navarre here. While his psyche has been transformed in the sense that it is, like I said, more vibrant, more alive, his body has also changed. And this is a storyline that I kind of called in the first book. I did predict that. I think I said it in a video. I think I predicted that Navarre would become fat from the Speck Plague. And I am still not sure how I feel about this storyline because I obviously don't know where it's heading. This is a storyline that could potentially end up being a bit unfortunate in its implications about fatness. I don't think it will, though. So far, it has been handled well. Other characters are very prejudiced against Navarre for being fat, and Navarre himself shows a lot of internalized prejudice towards himself about it. He views himself with disgust and loathing, but I do not think that the book wants us to agree with him. In the first book with Gord, when that whole storyline came up, at first I wasn't really confident that the book would handle it well, but it ended up handling it really well. And I think so far, Navarre's change is also being handled well. I think that he is... I think that it is very much being shown that he is not to blame for this. Oh, in his case, it's a magical thing, so he's definitely not to blame for it. But there is a moment in the story which emphasizes that while he has not done anything quote unquote wrong to make himself fat, he acknowledges that neither did Gord. And Gord isn't fat for magic reasons. Gord is just fat. So the story very much does sort of accept the basic fact that some people are just fat. And it doesn't mean that they're to blame for it. It doesn't mean they did something wrong to make themselves fat. It's just a thing. And it's fine. And in particular with Navarre, there is an effort to show that his fatness really only really primarily hurts him through how other people treat him because of it, not inherently because of the fatness himself. He still has stamina and physical ability until he goes on a diet. Once he starts severely limiting his food intake, then his physical ability deteriorates because of the lack of food. But the fatness itself does not impact his physical ability. He is portrayed as sexually desirable and sexually potent, as weird as that is to say, because of course it is only once he gains all this weight that he loses his virginity, actually. And apparently he's able to keep going all night, so he has a lot of stamina in that regard as well. But there is still the potential, I don't know, there's the potential concern I have is that this might be something he will eventually cure himself of. And I'm not sure how I'll feel about that if that happens. Or maybe not. Maybe he's going to stay fat for the rest of this trilogy. which would be, in my opinion, the more interesting creative decision. You just don't see that. You don't see epic fantasy stories with fat protagonists who are just fat the whole way through. Like, if the protagonist starts out overweight, they will almost certainly lose weight by the end. But I'm hoping that that's not what happens here, because I think, you know, not even for any political reason. I just think it would be a more interesting story, something different from the general the general sort of sameness of body types for fantasy protagonists, and really fiction protagonists in general. So, and also, while we're on the topic of Nevare's weight, one thing that I was kind of surprised by, and that I'm still not quite sure I get, is why he's so surprised by his father's horrific response. To me, that felt like a given. Like, the moment he started going home while fat, I was like, oh, this is going to be some of the most horrific abuse that's been put on the page in these books. Like, obviously, his father is going to treat him horrifically because of this. But apparently Nevare didn't think so. Like, he was genuinely surprised. Which, I mean, obviously people can be fairly blind to sort of the faults of their family members, but I thought that Nevare was fairly well aware of the kind of person his father was by this point, but I guess not. I'm hoping that this whole thing will sort of permanently disabuse him of the notion that his father is a man worthy of respect at all, because he's not. He's a horrible person. I'm hoping that like Nevare sort of gets pushed away from his father, and maybe in the process away from his loyalty to Gernia as well. And that brings us to another topic, which is obviously the continued and now, frankly, much more prominent theme of the colonial relationship between Gernia and the Plains people. So in this section, we have several moments that sort of emphasize this. First of all, we have the dancing spindle scene, which, by the way, I really, really like the kind of unclimactic, almost casual way that the magic of the Plains people just gets destroyed, almost by an accident. A knife falls into the spindle, and it's all over. Obviously, it's not really an accident, because Nevare's other self caused it to happen, kind of. But, but I'm always a big fan of when huge things like that, like the end of magic, or the death of a god, or some sort of grand thing like that, happens sort of quietly, off in a corner somewhere where no one even notices it happen. I am reminded of my favorite scene from the third Mistborn book, which I will not talk about because it's a spoiler, but if you've seen my videos about the Hero of Ages, or if you've read the Hero of Ages, then you might know what I'm talking about. There is a similar scene there, which is my favorite scene in that entire trilogy, actually. So this is a really, really good scene here that I really enjoy. However, I do have a slight concern again, and this is more of a concern than the fat thing. Like, the fat thing I'm fairly confident is going to be handled at least decently, but I am getting some potential white saviory vibes from Nevare's arc right now. But it's more complicated than that. So there's this. So when he gets to the spindle, Nevare is the one who is able to access the spindle's magic, while the actual, like, Plains people who live there. There's a guy who's a half-breed, and he has like a plainswoman wife, I think, from what I remember, or daughter? I can't remember. Anyway, the two of them cannot. And in fact, the woman gets very, very upset when she realizes that Navarre can access the magic, because she takes it as a grave insult, because it's her people's magic, and she can't access it. So she is offended by the very implication that this Guernian man can. And in a vacuum, that scene is very troubling to me, because that's a very sort of old and tired racist trope of the white guy who comes into the non-white culture and is immediately better than they are at their own traditions. So it has the vibes of white saviorism, but I'm not entirely sure whether I actually think it is. Because, of course, the reason Navarre can do this is because he has been used and really continues to be used as a tool by the people whose powers he is accessing. Not the Plains people, but the Specs. The Specs do, like, the tree woman used him as a tool, and I think that he still is a tool. Of course, in this scene, everything he does with the magic of the spindle isn't really done by him, it's done by his other self, and his other self is loyal to the Specs. So in a weird way, Navarre is a white savior, but he is a white savior who has been completely robbed of his agency by the people whose culture he is sort of being taken into. And that's a really interesting dynamic. Again, I don't know where it will go. Depending on where it ends up going, we could see a situation where it morphs into an actual white savior narrative, a more traditional one, in which case I will not be the biggest fan. Like, if Navarre ends up sort of his own free will, like, becoming the leader of the Spec people or some bullshit like that, that's gonna be a bit lame. But if we keep this tension of him essentially being used by the Specs for their own purposes against his will, that might be interesting. It's too early to tell, but I did want to sort of just like put it out there that I have some concerns about that storyline, but that I also see some very interesting potential in it, if it is handled the right way. What else goes on here? Yes, the other major sort of through line that I want to talk about here is the fascinating way that this section of the book suddenly starts going into religion. So, we haven't really seen much religion in the first book, weirdly enough, even though this is a very religious society. And everyone is constantly talking about religion and about the good God and so forth. And there's been mention of the old gods and stuff like that. What we haven't actually seen is actual religious practices, really. And here we see them. We see a wedding, of course, but that doesn't matter as much. But more importantly, there are these two scenes that are very explicitly juxtaposed with each other by the narrative. One scene is of the family of Navarre's new sister-in-law sacrificing birds to the old gods at an altar in their garden. In like a very explicit sort of bloody, brutal animal sacrifice. It's sort of, when Navarre sees it, he sort of reacts instinctively with horror and disgust and, you know. And it's very much framed in a way that's clearly supposed to make the reader go, oh God, The old gods are evil, they require sacrifice and blood and so forth. But then, we get the scene of Nivare and his mother praying to the good god in their family chapel. And with the good god, the sacrifice you make is like a little bit of incense that you burn. And here we get this quote from Nivare. Let me find it. An instant later I recognized that I did think her incense sacrifices were silly. They were play acting, religion by rote, an offering that cost us so little as to be insignificant. How, I suddenly wanted to know, did burning a brick of leaves and oil benefit the good god? What sort of a foolish merchant god did we worship, that he dispensed blessings in exchange for smoke? And this line sort of like fascinates me, because there's actually a really interesting like theological, religious discussion going on here in the book about this sort of change that happened at one point in history. Because indeed, religions for a lot of human history did quite heavily feature sacrifice. They featured either, well, not always human sacrifice, but very often animal sacrifice or sacrifices of grain and so forth. And this includes sort of the Old Testament of the Bible, where you see, Cain and Abel obviously come to blows over whose sacrifices God likes more. And God prefers meat. God prefers a living animal sacrifice to him. And that was sort of the paradigm of religion for a very long part of human history. And then at some point, this sort of became, I guess, it became more symbolic. Sacrifices stopped being, actual like animals or actual produce or anything like that, and it became sort of distanced from that. Instead, it would be more like a symbolic thing, like, oh, you'd burn some incense as like not really a direct sacrifice, not really a sacrifice, but more like something that represents sacrifice. Like you're still burning something for God, but it's no longer something that serves any other function. You're not actually giving anything away. You're just performing the action of sacrifice without actually sacrificing anything. And this is, in fact, sort of a change that happened to pretty much every religion at some point. And of course, it did make religion a lot more accessible to people, because suddenly it was no longer just those who could afford to sacrifice a lot who did it. But I do think that it also made, I think it made religion feel less real in some ways to people. Because if you sacrifice something, if you sacrifice a life or something valuable to the God that you believe in, I feel like that adds a bit of emotional weight to that moment and makes it much easier to believe that there is some real power at work there. And without that, I think religion sort of becomes more a series of rituals without really the according sort of sense of a connection to the supernatural. Now, I myself am not religious, but I study religions. It's one of the things that I'm interested in. It's not what my PhD is about, but it is what my master's was about. And as such, this whole thing fascinates me because it feels like Robin Hobb is speaking to so many of the conversations that are happening within religious studies, within religious anthropology, or at least that have happened historically, about this evolution of religion and about the evolution of sacrifice. But it also reminds me of David Graeber's book called Debt, The First 5,000 Years, which is a history of debt. And that book very much talks about how religion is sort of founded on the idea of debt. Debts we owe God and how we pay them back. And animal sacrifice was the way to pay back your debt to God. Whereas now, the way that people pay back their debts to God is more symbolic, less of a literal debt being paid, and more of a sort of like acknowledgement that there is a debt, but not an actual attempt to pay it off. And if you look at it through this lens of debt, Nevare's comment here is actually very insightful. What sort of foolish merchant god do we worship that he dispenses blessings in exchange for smoke? Yeah, that does make him a merchant god. He's not asking you for something because it's valuable to you, he's just asking you for something because things need to be exchanged, because of the logic of capital. And it makes perfect sense for a society that is sort of starting down the road towards what we would call capitalism, which is what Guernian society is doing, I would say. They're not quite there yet, it's still more mercantile than capitalist, I would say, but I do think they're sort of heading towards an industrial revolution pretty soon, and sort of with that comes an even more mercantile attitude towards everything in life, where everything becomes commodified, everything becomes tradable, and therefore, so does prayer, so do the blessings of God. So, I've rambled on too much about this. I just wanted to say how much I like that little beat and the implications of it. And I'm going to end this video, by talking about another quote here, which is maybe probably my favorite quote from these two books from the parts that I've seen so far. From all of the parts that I've covered in the videos. Which is when Nevare is sort of wondering whether his weight gain is magical in nature, which of course it is, but he says this: "It could not be. I didn't believe in magic. I didn't believe in magic desperately, the same way that a badly wounded soldier did not believe in amputation. Take it away, I prayed to the good God. If this be magic, put it out of my life and save me from it." That is such a good analogy, the amputation analogy. The idea that, on some level, he knows for a fact that it is magic, just like that soldier knows his leg needs to be amputated. And he knows, so he knows the answer to his question. He knows the solution to his problem, but it's a solution that he doesn't want to think about, he doesn't want to engage with, because its consequences, its implications are too horrifying to imagine. And so he just chooses not to believe in it, even though on some level he is aware of it. I really like that. In general, I feel like the writing quality has jumped through the roof in this section. I am so impressed by Hobb's writing here. Anyway, that is pretty much everything I have to say about this section, other than, fuck Carcina, by the way. Carcina sucks. I hope we never see her again. She sucks. Yeah, I am really excited after a month off because of goddamn COVID to finally get back to reading this book and actually moving through it and recording more videos. Thankfully I had just enough of a backlog to get through this month. We'll see if I manage to not skip any weeks going forward, because my backlog has been wiped out. But hopefully I'll see you next week, and not in like 2 or 3 weeks. but who knows? See you.